I've known that I've had an anterior pelvic tilt, but I didn't know how bad it was until I saw this picture and decided enough is enough. So I set out to increase my knowledge, but there's a lot of information about anterior pelvic tilt. Hello? Yes. Tom Cruise can't make it? And you want me to fill in? Yeah, I can squeeze you in. Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Bye. Before we get into the 3 things that I'm doing to fix my anterior pelvic tilt, we need to talk about what the heck it is. Well, it's just that the pelvis is tilting forward, so the front of the pelvis appears lower and the back of the pelvis appears higher. An anterior pelvic tilt is very common. It's been suggested that 85% of men and 75% of women have some degree of anterior pelvic tilt. Anywhere between 4 and 10 degrees of anterior pelvic tilt is completely normal. The issue arises when we have excessive anterior pelvic tilt. When we have excessive anterior pelvic tilt, we might start to lose some motion at the hip. And maybe because of this loss of motion, we're putting stress on other areas of the body, which is why you'll commonly see anterior pelvic tilt linked to back pain. So if you're having mobility restrictions or the muscle imbalances are leading to functional limitations or symptoms, I think you should be addressing the things causing your anterior pelvic tilt. And when we think about an anterior pelvic tilt, we think about tight or overactive hip flexors. Maybe combine this with things like a tight, overactive lumbar rector spine muscles. And then you also have some weaknesses on the other side. So weak abdominals or underactive abdominals, weak glutes or underactive glutes. You can also see this with poor postural habits or with individuals that do a lot of sitting throughout the day. And there's also some structural variation in our pelvises. So your pelvis and the degree of which your hip joint interacts with your pelvis is going to be different than mine. So there are some structural factors that can contribute to an anterior pelvic tilt. Feel free to jump ahead in the video if you think one might be more beneficial for you than the others. But we're lengthening under load, lengthen under load, working on some core stability and core strengthening. And 3 is we're trying to increase proximal hamstring activation to pull the back of that pelvis back down into a more neutral position. For me, one of the major things I'm going to focus on is lengthening under load. So it's not as much of a stretch and hold versus taking exercises that I'm already doing and changing the emphasis a little bit. For me, I feel this way I can attack whether it's weak glutes, tight hip flexors, I can attack 2 things at once. So 2 exercises come to mind for this. And the first is a split squat. So a split squat, and the emphasis here is not so much on weight. So maybe I'll do a couple sets for my strengthening with my strengthening sets and reps. But this one is going to be more for getting a stretch in the hip flexor and the quad. And instead of my progression being on weight or volume, it's just depth or range of motion. So I'm going down as far as I can go. Back is flat, so I'm not overextending here. I have my core engaged. I really feel stretch here, stretch here. And then once you get the hang of it, you add the load. Really feel a good stretch, hang out there. 5 and up. 2 birds, 1 stone exercise for an anterior pelvic tilt is the glute bridge. So, start with no weight. You're here, core is tight, back is flat, and then we just really drive through the heels to come up as high as you can get. Now there's a key distinction here. Not as high as I can get here, because then I'm extending the lower back. Back's gotta be flat, core's gotta be engaged. Bridge up. And you'll feel it hip flexors definitely, maybe a little bit of quad. So over here, we're stretching both of those, also strengthening the glute. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, down, and up. A lot of easy ways to progress this. You can add weight. Here, same thing. Make sure you're getting a nice long hold. 1, 2, 3. Or you could go one leg, extend one leg, back is still flat, bridge up. I'm still feeling that stretch in front, but I'm also feeling a lot more on this right glute. And same thing for the left. In general, a multi-joint progressive strengthening program would bring a lot of benefit if you are someone who has excessive anterior pelvic tilting. The second thing I'm working on is improving my core strength. I know this is an area that I lack in. And specifically, I'm talking about the transverse abdominis, which is a deep core muscle that's important in stabilizing the lower back and the pelvis. So to activate that TRA, that transverse abdominis muscle, you're gonna get in this position. Once you're here, you're gonna find those two bones at the front of the hip that kind of stick out. You're gonna go an inch. So on my right side, you're gonna go an inch in and an inch down. An inch in, an inch down. When the TRA is activating, this is a good spot where you can feel it. So you'll have some feedback on if you're doing this correctly or not. So belly button draws towards spine. At the same time, you won't have a gap between your low back and the floor. So if you have a big gap there, when you're activating the TRA, that gap is going to close down and your back will be totally flat against the mat. So the first step is just being able to activate it and hold and make sure you're able to breathe in this position. But from here, we can make things harder as long as you feel like you have a good activation. And one way to do that is to get in that activation position, belly button towards spine, back goes flat. You can feel it with your hand, and then one leg at a time, we're just kicking straight out. 1, 2, 3. Make sure you're breathing, and switch legs. Straight out. 1, 2, 3, and switch. Important that you're holding this the whole time. 1, 2, 3. Back's nice and flat, TRA is engaged. 1, 2, 3. A progression up from this would be starting here. It's the same thing, you're still kicking one out at a time, but you're just holding that here. And this one's hard for me, so I know it's something I need to work on. Make sure back is flat, belly button's still going towards spine. If that's still pretty easy for you, you can introduce some upper body movements. So same position where you're here, and a lot of people do alternating arm and leg. So right leg goes out, left leg goes back. Most important, you still have that good contraction of the core and back, and then you'd switch. Straight out, straight up. And think kicking out, down with your feet. Not so much up, but down and return. And one more I've been working on is the double leg lowering. Similar to the ones we just said. Same position, back's flat, both legs start up. And we are just slowly lowering. Make sure belly button's drawn towards the spine. Low as you can go. Then in, back up, and slow. And a way to progress with this is try to get your feet a little bit lower the more you practice. And the last piece of this puzzle for me is improving my hamstring activation. So a lot of times people with an anterior pelvic tilt might have decreased activation and or strength of the hamstring and or the glute. So we addressed the glute with some of the stuff we were working on before, but the hamstring, let's get into a 90-90 position with a chair or a wall. But with the chair, you need a little bit of a spacer in between the knees. So pillow, yoga block, a ball, anything like that will work. Feet are going to be slightly angled out from the knees, just a little bit. And all we're doing here is we're pushing down into our heels, into the chair. You'll feel hamstrings engaged, and you should be thinking of that tension in the back of the thigh traveling down towards the proximal hamstrings. And once you're here, we'll take a big breath in through the nose, out through the mouth. And relax. And back up. Activate the hamstrings. Think of that tension traveling down proximally. The hips are going to lift ever so slightly, but we don't want glute to engage here. We're just working on hamstring.